We're all going through this unspoken cycle of collective grief. We're all in different places at any given time, right? Some people have already reached acceptance, but most people are still grieving and angry about time that was lost. They're grieving opportunities maybe that were lost, right? There are dozens of rejection stories that people may have just from the pandemic moment alone, And so I think we're all in this cycle.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Christine Platt. Christine is an author and advocate for embracing the power of less to simplify, surrender, and boldly step into the next season of your life. Christine has written more than 24 books for readers of all ages. She has also spent more than 20 years serving as an advocate in academia, governments, nonprofits, and the private sector, including, if I got my facts right, as working as an environmental policy advisor for Obama. But after choosing to chronicle her journey to minimalism, she became widely known as the Afrominimalist, which you may know her as on Instagram. The Black woman who started a movement by encouraging people to forego the aesthetics of mainstream minimalism and instead focus on living with authenticity and intention. Christine, welcome to My Rejection Story.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so excited.
Me too. So, as I was preparing for this interview, I was listening to some recordings you did on other people's podcasts. And a story you said that really stuck with me is you spoke about how you never felt pressured to fall into a certain career by your mom. So
Yeah.
she wouldn't answer your question of what should you do or what shouldn't you do. And I think that that's such a beautiful gift she gave, because it's probably something that led to the career you now have, and maybe not self-rejecting a lot of paths you could have taken. Would you
Yeah.
agree? Do you think that parental support
I
plays a big role?
I would agree now. I would have to say though, when I was younger, it would annoy me so much. I just wanted her to tell me what to do so badly. And but yeah, now that I'm older, I realize it's been such a gift. It's allowed me to pivot and reinvent myself without guilt or shame, or a lot of things that a lot of folks struggle with when they think about writing or rewriting part of their life story. And so yeah, it has been a gift. It's something that I'm really grateful for. And again, it's now upon reflection. And I think talking to so many other people who feel very pressured that they have to stay in one particular life or stay in one particular lane. And I feel like it really leads to a very limiting life. And in retrospect, what I realize now is that she didn't want me to go through life having these limitations or thinking that I could only be or should only be one thing. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful for it now.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I feel like a big part of parenting right is allowing your children to feel discomforts and not providing
Yeah,
all the answers. So
yeah.
yeah, I'm glad she gave that to you. In being able to, because I mean, I read out your bio, and I mean, you worked in so many different, you've been in so many spaces, from law to, I mean, tons of books. It feels like you're like a million people with all the things you've achieved in your life.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I kind of feel that way too. I feel like as I'm getting closer to 50 and my daughter is off to college and I'm an empty nester and I'm in this new phase of sort of figuring out, well, who I am, who am I now, and it's interesting to be in a place where I'm like, wow, I feel like I've done all the things that I said that I wanted to do. And I told someone the other day, Alice, I said, I think I'm leaving my era of doing and I'm entering my era of being. I'm just no longer doing, I'm just being, and figuring out what that means and what that looks like for me. And it's a very interesting place to be when you have done so much. And when people sort of have these expectations that you're going to keep doing so much. And so, yeah, it's a really sweet spot for me to be in a new space for me. So I'm learning how to navigate that a little bit.
What does it feel like being in a space of being and not doing? Because I can't imagine. I always feel like not
I
enough is being
mean,
done.
yeah, it is, there are moments that it feels very uncomfortable because I think that we are so conditioned to do and to go and to always be in pursuit of the next thing. I think it's the first time in my life where I was telling one of my girlfriends this the other day. I said, it feels so weird to not have a plan. It feels so weird to not have like a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, right? And so, this space of being, really learning to sit with myself, really learning to reflect on a lot of the lessons that I've learned, really learning to celebrate some of the things that I just missed out on celebrating properly because I was always on to the next thing. You know what I mean? Like it's both liberating, it's humbling, it's there are moments of sadness. You know what I mean? Like it's a
Yeah.
very interesting space to be in. And I'm grateful to be here, but I don't want to lie and make it seem like it feels amazing to just be being. You know what I mean? It's like, no, there are times when I'm very uncomfortable that I don't necessarily have a plan for what is next, right? And this is like beyond my life as an author. I feel like, I have a book coming out in October. I have a kids book that just came out, but these are projects that already done. You know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah,
nothing for
yeah.
me to do. And so, yeah, I'm really trying to learn to sit in that discomfort. And, in order to just be in a place of being, it also requires you to really be with yourself. And I think when we're in this constant sort of mode of doing, 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 going, going, going all the time, we don't really get a chance to be with ourselves. We're just always going. And so it's almost weird. It's like the first time I'm getting to sit with myself and spend time with myself, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I like that you touch on the discomfort, and I appreciate your honesty, the discomfort of being and sitting with yourself. Because something you touched on is the feelings of discomfort and not knowing what's coming next, is what I was hearing. And I think we can even go back a bit, and I want to ask you about when you were studying, because you were I think at some point there was like less than 10 people in your class and you didn't know what you were going to do next. And so I don't think it's the first time in your life where you don't know what's coming next. And you seem to have the ability to sit with that. And I think that a lot of people struggle with that, and I think that's where we fall into like the 5 year plan, the 10 year plan, when really it's how could we possibly make plans based on the very limited data we have right now. So yeah, tell me, going back a bit, about making decisions where you didn't actually know how it was going to pan out, you just trusted that this is the right next move.
Yeah, I think I love that you say that because that's something that I remind myself too now all the time. I'm like, we go through these cycles in life, right? Like we go through these cycles of learning and growing, of doing something new, of letting something go. And, whether it's something that has been sort of structured for us, right? So, for example, a structured sort of path would be like if you go through education, right? It's just like you're going to go to elementary school, you're going to go to middle school, right? But every beginning has an end. We know this, right? That is like impossible for that not to be part of our life cycle. And so in those moments where I do feel the discomfort or where I do feel like, man, like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, but you've been here before, right? And like our body remembers, the mind remembers. And so tapping back into, and like, as you said, looking back and thinking back, because I think that's the real thing. I haven't been here in so long. You know what I mean? A big part of that is because, I was a parent. I was mothering, right? So for 18 to 21 years, I knew exactly what was going to be happening, right? And so this is the first time I was sharing how I've been an adult mothering a child longer than I've been an adult mothering myself.
Wow. Wow.
And so it's like I have to remind myself, like, you have not been solely responsible for yourself in over 21 years, right? So some of that is like remembering what that felt like. And yeah, it's a really interesting space. I have to like look back and like think back and dig really hard. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened and I figured it out. And I think those memories and not losing touch of those moments in our lives, it's so important because, I mean, this is called my rejection story, right? We all have a rejection story and we all have multiple rejection stories, right? But in those moments when we're going through it, it can feel so permanent. It can feel like this is the end, when in reality, right, everything is temporary, right? And so, like, I think looking back on those moments and memories and looking at times when we also thought it was the end of the world or we didn't know what we were going to do and remembering like, oh yeah, but I figured it out and I moved on and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? Oftentimes those worst situations, once we're on the other side, we look back with nostalgia and we're like, I was down and out, but in retrospect, that was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? But in the moment, it's like, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. I'm down and out. And so I think knowing that we have so many of those touch points on the timelines of our lives, right? It almost is like a built in sort of guidebook, playbook, um, even sort of like a book to or a guide to just remind us of who we are in those hard moments and in those difficult moments. And so, yeah, I have like all of that going on. And some days I feel like I've got it all together. And then other days I'm like, what am I doing?
Yeah,
But I'm
yeah.
enjoying the process.
I really appreciate you saying this, and especially, that what you just touched on about how in the thick of it, it feels permanent and it feels awful, and we can look back at it and frame it all part of the story. Oh, because I went through that, I was able to figure out how to do this, and it's all part of the story. And that's a big reason why I started this podcast, is to hear that side of things. So when you look back and you go back to times where you were perhaps younger and maybe you didn't have the memories, because now, the beauty of being older and more experienced is you can look back at things and know that you've survived hard things before. But do you have any memories of times when maybe you didn't have that to work on? You didn't know that you could go through that? What was happening and what were you thinking at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime we are experiencing something for the first time, right? Like we have no playbook, we have no, it's like maybe the first time you lose your job, right? Or the first time you go through a breakup. That first time of anything is like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? Um, and so it's so interesting because I'm trying to think like what were some of those memories, and I think you kind of forget some of those first times, right? Like, and that's what I mean by like the permanence of certain things, right? It's like at the time, I'm sure it felt like the worst thing ever in my life. And how am I going to survive? And here I am 30, 40 years later. And I'm like, I don't even remember. You know what I mean? And I think there's also like beauty in that too, right? It's like it makes you understand that some life lessons we just take with us and they were just little blips on the timeline of our lives, right? And then, we take them and we use that information and what we learned and however we ended up dealing with it. And it almost just becomes a part of who we are, right? I'm wondering, like, maybe I can't even remember because whatever that lesson is that I learned, it just became a part of who I am, right? Maybe the
Yeah.
first time, I don't know, I got rejected by a boy or something, right? Like I'm sure I mean I can't remember who he I'm sure it happened, but I can't remember who he is, what he looked like, what his name was, right? And I think there's beauty in that, right? It's like, man, at one point in my life, I am sure that moment consumed me, and now I don't even know or care who
Yeah.
this person is, right? So I think there's a lot of power in memory. I think there's also a lot of power in looking back and reframing some of those tough stories, right? Like we always have agency to sort of not necessarily cling to the worst part of the narrative, but go back and reframe it. And I think that's something that I've done throughout my lifetime. So that may also be why I can't remember it in such detail, because I think there's a lot of power there, right? Like you don't want to get stuck believing a limiting story or a story that isn't serving you. I think that there is a lot of power in looking back on some of the toughest moments of your life and reframing them and seeing how they've served you and who you are now. So, my friends and I, we play this game every year, and it's called Highest Highs and Lowest Lows. And basically, at the end of the year, what we do is we all get together and we look back and we say, what were some of the lowest lows of this past year, and what were some of the highest highs? And it's almost unanimous. Sorry. Can you hear that? Can you hear people talking?
Yeah, but don't worry, it's okay. It's
You
mostly
sure?
kind of
Okay.
like, yeah,
All
yeah.
right, I'm gonna go back. It's almost unanimous that our lowest lows have a way of leading to our highest highs, right? So, for example, we can go to, I think job loss is something that is so common right now. And one of my dear friends, Julie, I remember a couple years ago when, she got laid off from her job, and it was so, she had been there, she thought she was going to be there forever. And it ended up being like this launch point for her business, and to see where her business is now 5 years later, right? But we remember like that year in particular, that was like her lowest low, and it had happened in like March. And by the time we were playing the game in December, it was already part of her highest high. It had led to her highest high. And so I think sometimes looking at our lowest lows, seeing how those moments, no matter how difficult they were, because I don't want to like take away from the fact that these things are hard. Like I do want people to know it's important to feel, and it's important to grieve, and it's important to emote all of the hard and difficult times, but also to understand that there is a way that they can lead to our highest highs. And so to not always sort of look through that lens of, man, this is the worst, once you move on, but go back and think about it and see how it may have framed some of your highest highs.
You touch on so much that I want to explore here because I have been thinking of how like it is just an unfounded theory of lowest lows leading to highest highs, because I've noticed in my own life that often a period of things being really bad are followed by a very high period. And I've noticed it in some of my friends' lives too, and they've commented too, that confirming that that holds true. So I want to know why you think that's the case. And I know it doesn't happen to everyone. There are some people whose lives are filled with a lot of darkness and misery, and it seems relentless. But in the cases of what we're talking about, which I think is your life and my life, do you have any thoughts on why that happens?
You also mentioned something that I don't just want to gloss over, and that is that, some people, their lives, it does seem to be like this constant, like, man, I'm never going, am I ever going to get ahead? Am I ever going to make it to the next thing, right? And I think in those moments, of course, it's harder to, sort of look through this lens of, like, everything is going to be okay, right? I think we have a way of like sugarcoating sorrow, and I don't want to do that, right? But in those circumstances where, it is sort of this cycle of life that so many of us seem to follow, where it's like, whew, lowest low, yay, I'm back on top of the world, and I'm down again. You know what I mean? I think it's so important to look back on those moments to understand that it is part of the cycle of life, right? Like, there is no one that I know, and probably no one short of someone who is like, in a Buddhist temple, really honing in on self mastery, that is not, I don't know anyone that is immune to heartache. I don't know anyone that is immune to struggle. I don't know and I know people who are very, very wealthy. So I know that wealth is not like the answer and the cure all, and nor is it a buffer from some of, life's hardest challenges. And so I think in those moments where we look at our highest highs and our lowest lows, and we do it with friends and we do it in community, it sort of allows us to normalize this life cycle of, winning and losing, of doing and being, of, sitting still sometimes, and other times just always being on the go, right? I think we come to understand that it's just a part of humanity, is that like you literally cannot be on top all the time, right?
Yeah.
You literally cannot win all the time. Sometimes you're going to have to get rejected, right? And like, I think learning and accepting that that is a part of humanity can be very empowering, and helping you get through those moments when you are in your lowest low. It's like I'm in my lowest low right now, but I'm gonna it's gonna lead to my highest high, or my highest high is coming. And I think, there's a lot of self-talk that has to go into self-soothing and
Yeah.
survival. Like we really need that.
Yeah, I love that. And I what I want to ask you about, so you spoke about just now is reframing, and you spoke about that earlier. And now you've just touched on self-talk and self-soothing. And I do think that there are some people out there who struggle to, I guess, reframe a rejection. So they maybe were rejected by a partner 20 years ago and they still haven't reframed or tried to understand it from a different lens, and they're stuck in that anger phase, which is not, I mean, it serves a purpose at some point in time, but if you're sitting with it decades later, it's not usually not very productive. So talk to me a little bit about reframing. How do you how because I mean, if you don't hold on to your rejection stories, and I will just say that the science is that we remember rejection stories, so people rarely vividly remember rejection. So if you don't
Mm.
remember it, you're clearly doing something very amazing, and I'd love to hear how you're reframing these
I
stories.
mean, I'm sure if I drill down real deep, you know what I mean, and like went into some like deep meditative sort of state, then
But the
I
fact
would
that you
remember,
have to do that.
right? But I think I think a big part of it for me is like I spent, I think, an early part of my life being very pessimistic. The sky is always falling. It's the worst. I'm a Capricorn. And so just being like very practical. And, it was in graduate school when I realized, like, wow, this is not serving me. I sort of went through the world with this. Rather, I would rather expect the worst and be surprised, you know what I mean, than expect the best and be disappointed. And that sort of approach to life, I very vividly remember being 19 years old and being like, this is not serving me, right? Because if I only focused on that, or if that was like my everything was just the worst, even the good things that were happening, I was expecting the worst. And so I think I've taken great care to allow myself to experience whatever I'm experiencing in the moment. And if it was ended up being something that was super traumatic, reframing it for myself. And the reframing is telling yourself a new story, right? So it's like whenever I feel myself holding on to a story that is no longer serving me, excuse me, I'm like, oh, it's time for me to reframe that, right? So, for example, I am now remembering a rejection story, and I'm remembering a rejection story about an early novel that I worked on. This is when I was like first in publishing and just so hopeful and naive. I knew nothing about the process in retrospect. Um, I had a book contract that fell through, and it was heartbreaking for me. And I was at an event one day, and it was for a group of Black women writers, and everyone's going around the room and they're talking about like what they work on and whatever. And I start telling this story. Now I'm working on other projects. I've done other stuff, and I start telling this story. And this was maybe like I'm 10 years into publishing. This was probably like year two. And I'm like, I'm Christine Platt, and I write fiction and nonfiction. And, I was working on this, and I start to go into this story. And the woman who was leading that workshop, her name is Marita Golden, wonderful writer. She's done so much for the Black writing community and just for literature in general. And I will never forget, she looked at me and she said, you know what? I've heard that story before. You need to stop telling it. And it was in that moment where I realized, oh, I have made that rejection a part of my story, right?
Mm.
I had given it more power than it deserved. I had given it more power than it actually had. It hadn't stopped my writing career. It hadn't, thrown my life off balance or change the direction or anything. I mean, literally, books get rejected every day, right? It was just a rejection, but I had held on to it. Excuse me. But I had held on to that so tightly that here I was at an event and someone was saying, I've heard that story before. And she's older than me, and it came from this place of like motherly auntie wisdom guidance. Like, I'm not going to say much more and embarrass you in front of this room full of people, but girl, you need to stop telling that story. You need to move on. Not like you're working on other stuff, you're doing other stuff. You need to move on. And I will always appreciate Marita Golden for that. It was a really defining moment for me. And I think moving forward, it made me very conscious to not make every rejection, every disappointment, every failure a part of my introduction, a part of it, like a
Mm.
part of me so deeply that after I say my name, that's what I'm leading with, as opposed to what I'm doing or how I overcome that, right? And so a reframing of that would be, man, I remember the first time one of my book manuscripts got, rejected. And it was heartbreaking for me, and it was so hard for me to let go of that narrative. But if I am honest with myself in retrospect, when I go back, right, if I were to look at what I turned in and how rushed it was and how the story wasn't as formulated, as it should have been, it probably should have been rejected, right? And what that rejection did was make me a better writer, make me more determined, make me real like, do you really want to be an author? Because if so, this is what you're going to have to deal with, right? Like, you're going to have to deal with the rejection. How bad do you really want it, right? I mean, I think the reframing is just, it's not going back and changing the facts, because the facts are what they are. I think there are a lot of people who are like, tell yourself a new story. And it's like, no, this is what happened. But now that reframing is like I can see it from a different perspective, and here is how it helped me. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, I love that because, just especially the story you gave, I think that we can do a few things with rejections, and they some can be constructive and some can be unconstructive. So using, when you were talking about that rejection and someone telling you, you've shared this before, it makes me think of times where I have almost used rejection, like not necessarily like something overtly rejection, not like getting a book rejected, but growing up, I was always told that I'm bad at sports, or like that I would get my friends would sort of laugh at how uncoordinated I was. So I'd have this defense of if anyone puts me in a place where there is a ball involved, I would say I'm bad at sports, and that's like it's a defense mechanism because it's like I don't want you to have any expectation of me. I don't want you
Right.
to laugh at me if I have said it first. And I could see
Hmm.
maybe you sharing that rejection story could be something similar. It's like I I'm not doing this because I'm normalizing rejection. I'm doing it because I want to lower the bar in a way so I could see it being very constructive. Would you
Yeah.
agree to get rid of the
I
story?
I think at the time I was seeking sympathy. Just wanted everyone to feel so bad for me, right? Like, oh, it's so, you know what I mean? Like, and I think I love that you bring that up because I do think it is important to understand what we are attaching to the rejection story, right? Why we're holding on to it. Is it a defense mechanism? Are we seeking sympathy? Are we seeking someone to agree with us, right? And say, like, yeah, you were wrong. They shouldn't have rejected you, right? Like, sometimes we're seeking validation, affirmation. And I think once we learn the reason that we've become attached to this rejection story and narrative and why we can't let it go, therein lies the answer that needs to be the reframing, right? So it's like for me, man, I'm just keep telling this story so everyone could say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you," right? Like, and her being like, "Girl, we heard that story before. You need to tell a new story," right? It was just like, you know, and to hear other people share their book rejection stories, right? I think it's really important to understand why we're holding on to a rejection story because I think if we're not careful, it can become a limiting belief, right? If we're holding on to it so tightly that that's what we lead with, that's what we hold on to, then we start to believe what we're saying, right? We start to believe I'm not good at sports, right? We start to believe my every book manuscript I turn in is going to get rejected, right? Because this happened. And so, a big part of it is understanding why that particular rejection story. Because
Yeah.
you have rejection stories that you can't remember, I assure you, right? It's like, why am I holding on to this one? I think it's a opportunity to do like a little self-discovery and deeper inquiry to figure out what is going on there.
Thank you for giving the listeners such a great toolkit to go and uncover. So I'm sure listening, some rejections are coming to mind, the rejections that the listeners, that you guys hold on to. And yeah, as those rejections come to mind, I think Christine has laid out a beautiful toolkit to kind of do a bit more of a deep dive into why you're holding on to that rejection so much. Because I think there are, and you touched on this, there are times where a rejection might have a beautiful reframe. Like you touched on, Christine, how it can motivate you to really prove yourself. And so if it is in that lens, that's very constructive. But if it's in the lens of the example I gave, which me deciding I'm bad at sports, it's not constructive. I'm not using that in a constructive way at all. I'm working on
And
it.
you can reframe that though. You can say like, I'm not the best at sports, right? But it's like I'm one thing that I'm learning as I'm sitting here in my learning how to be and being with myself is like we become very committed to the stories that we tell ourselves. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? I don't think I was as aware of how convincing I can be. with the own stories that I tell myself, right? And so like even if we know, man, every time they throw a ball at me, I do miss it. You know what I mean? It's just like I'm not the best at sports, but I'm trying is so
Yeah.
different than I'm just not good at sports, right? Like the latter is very much a resigned, it leaves no room for growth, it leaves no room for opportunity, right? And so, like, I'm learning to be very mindful of language and very mindful of what I am telling myself
Yeah.
because I'm going to believe it and I'm going to act accordingly. Like, whatever I tell myself, my mind, my body, my soul, that's what we're going to believe, and that's how we're going to move through the world,
Yeah, it's
good or
so
bad.
true. I think I have never, I never gave enough credit to the language we use with ourselves, but it's true. I mean, been lucky enough to have people point out some of the language I use that is very limiting, and yeah, no wonder I struggle in those areas if I'm making straight statements that I'm bad at something. Like, well, there's not much room for improvement there.
Yeah, it's like we don't even try when we do that, right? So if I tell myself, like, man, I'm just the worst at whatever, I start to believe that. And so it's just like, well, why even try? I already know I'm the worst. Like, that is how and it doesn't happen immediately. You know what I mean? But over time, that limiting thought or statement that limiting thought or statement can become a limiting belief that we cling to and hold on to. And I think I'm also more cognizant of that, Alice. Let me just be honest, because I did just finish, I just finished writing Less is Liberation. And a big part of finding personal freedom, I realized, is letting go of some of those limiting beliefs that have caused our limiting behaviors and outlook on life. And so I'm probably much more aware now because of that.
Yeah, and we were just talking about so Less's Liberation is releasing in October this year. So tell me a little bit, yeah, about what you've been working on for the book and how that ties to what we were just talking about letting go and yeah, any insights that maybe the listeners can take away.
Yeah, I mean, I think I shared a lot of it. The book itself for me really took me on this sort of personal exploration that I perhaps wasn't quite prepared for. Um, I think when you write nonfiction, prescriptive nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, I think sometimes you forget that you may have to like go through some of the processes that you're sharing with readers. And I think because the Afrominimalist guide was different, right? I wrote that book upon reflection. I was 5 years out from, having gone through all the trauma of decluttering my house. And so I could like really look at it from a different lens and give readers a different type of prescriptive guidance. I think with Less is Liberation, because I was going through this process and this journey of self discovery myself, it was really, really hard. Like it was the hardest book, the most difficult book that I've written to date, right? So see, that's like a nice little reframing in the moment. To
Yeah,
date.
two
There
dates.
may be another book that challenges me, right? But I think really sitting down and doing that inner work, which I highly recommend for everyone, right? Like, I think we've been led to believe, like, oh, you have to go off to a retreat or, you have to, I don't know, do some sort of deep meditation to be introspective. But in reality, moments for introspection are happening to us all the time, right? That moment when we're in line at the grocery store and we just like zone out and start thinking about something. Like sometimes that is us being introspective. And I think leaning into those moments of introspection, I talk a lot in the book about the importance of self-assessment, which is what we're talking about here in my rejection story, right? Is like learning to self-assess those moments, those thoughts, those beliefs, those behaviors. And I just don't think that we make enough time in our lives to self assess. And so the idea is to do less and have less to do. So you have more time to sort of focus on yourself. And the subtitle of the book is Finding Freedom from a Life of Overwhelm, because I do feel like a lot of the overwhelm in our lives. Now, I didn't feel this way when I first started writing the book. When I first started writing the book, I blamed everyone else for my overwhelm, right? It's like, we live in this capitalist society and I have to do this. And you know what I mean? It was like so external. But through this process, realizing that a lot of the overwhelm in our life is self induced. You know what I mean? And sitting down and self assessing and saying, where could I choose less? Where could I say no? What is really my responsibility to hold and what isn't, right? What are the identities that I am holding on to, right? What are the rejection stories that I'm holding on to that make me feel that I have to be doing so much or that I need to be doing so much, right? All of that is like pausing just to do some introspective work, self-assess, right? Figuring out what we need to let go, right? What stories are no longer ours to hold? What stories do we need to reframe? And how to move forward towards the lives that we want and deserve, right? And I think what's probably so uncomfortable for me about being in this place of being right now is that I've never taken the time to pause and sit with myself. Oh, hold on a second.
It's okay.
Sorry, they're
the
moving stuff out
the
there.
the Mac has a very great way of drowning out external sounds,
Okay,
so it's
perfect.
much louder for
Okay,
you, I think, than it is for me.
okay. Good. Yeah, so I was just saying, like, I feel that, it's really important. Less is Liberation is really designed to sort of take people on this journey of self discovery to sort of figure out how to be a little more selfish. And I've been sharing this definition of selfish that I found. I think you're going to love it. I loved it. It changed everything for me. I really had a lot of limiting beliefs around selfishness, right? I thought it was the worst possible thing that you could be. And so for much of my life, I did everything in my power to not be seen as someone who was selfish, to not be called selfish. And as I'm working on Less is Liberation, I really take some time to explore and define certain words, that I may have just used or statements that I had just used, right? I'm so overwhelmed. It's like, what does that mean exactly, right? Excuse me. What does that mean exactly? And then you read what it means and you're like, oh my God, like feeling like I'm unable to cope, like I'm drowning. And so selfish was one of those words. And I look up selfish. And of course, I see, the first definition is like whatever the most common one is, which is like lack of care and concern for others or lack of disregard for others. And then the very next definition is like being chiefly concerned with one's own profit and pleasure. And I was like, oh, I need to be selfish, like I need to be chiefly concerned. Doesn't mean that I'm only concerned, right? But it's like, I think I had been more chiefly concerned with others' profit and pleasure throughout my lifetime as opposed to my own, right? And so, a big part of the book is taking readers on this journey to figure out where do they need to be just a little more selfish, right? Where do they need to just be a little more in love with themselves enough to say no, to choose less, right? Like we're so conditioned to do more, to have more. We're so conditioned to know, like you have to put other people before yourself. And it's just like, but that is not a sustainable way to live. It's definitely not a way to not have a life of overwhelm. I can tell you that. I can tell you that because I was very overwhelmed trying to do for everyone and being chiefly concerned with everyone else more so than being chiefly concerned with myself. And so that is what less is liberation is. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. Really excited for that book to come out.
It sounds amazing, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. As you were talking about taking a pause and introspecting, it made me think of the pandemic and how, and I think I actually heard you talking about this on a podcast, but the pandemic made so many people deal with issues that they hadn't dealt with before and realize
Yeah,
things that they hadn't realized before. And I think because it just forced everyone to be
it
still and
did.
stop.
It
And
did. It did,
yeah,
Alice. I did. I talked about that on a podcast. I think it was, I was talking about how early on in the pandemic, and this is before we knew it was like going to be a thing. And
yeah,
we thought we were like, oh, we're just going to get 2 weeks. We're going to get like a little 2 week break. This is during the 2 week break.
I
And
remember that
so
time.
I remember that. Yeah. So I had read this article on CNN, everything on the news was, geared towards like how to prepare for isolation. And, so I'm just like reading everything. And I came across this article on CNN and they were interviewing this man. He was basically lived on an Italian island by himself and had lived in isolation for years. And what they asked him that really stuck with me was they said, what do you think is going to be the hardest thing for people to sort of deal with during this pandemic? And he said, I think a lot of people are going to really struggle because they've never spent this much time with themselves. And as they spend this time with themselves, what a lot of people are going to discover is that they don't like themselves very much. And I remember being like, whoa, you know what I mean? So I think that was kind of the start of, he had said something else like, oh, but a lot of people won't use this pandemic as an opportunity to, be introspective. And I remember saying, oh, well, I'm going to use it as an opportunity. And whew, did I? And it sort of spilled over into this book. But yeah, I think the pandemic forced a lot of us, it forced us into isolation, but it didn't necessarily force us into introspection, right? It forced us to maybe learn some ways to self regulate. It maybe forced us to, sort of see what friendships were genuine and which ones were transactional. Like it helped in a lot of different ways, but not everyone necessarily used it as a moment for introspection. But there's no way. I mean, you had to be like totally disassociate for you to not learn something about yourself during that time. And I think a lot of people are still grappling with that. I think a lot of people are still grieving, and it's a very I look at the world as like we're all going through this unspoken cycle of collective grief. We're all in different places at any given time, right? Some people have already reached acceptance, but most people are still grieving and angry about time that was lost, right? They're grieving opportunities maybe that were lost, right? I mean, I imagine there are dozens of rejection stories that people may have
yeah,
um, just from the pandemic moment alone, And so I think we're all in this cycle of collective grief and healing. And I think I've learned to look at it that way just because it allows me to have a little more grace and compassion for myself and also others, right? Like, it's a tough time. I don't know why we're not talking about it more. I don't know why we aren't, again, sort of sitting with and pausing and taking a moment to really think about what that time has done to us individually and collectively. But yeah, so I talk a little bit about that in the book too, because I just think it's so important, you know?
yeah, yeah. It's kind of trippy how we've society seems to have forgotten about that time when really it
Yeah.
did have huge effects. I know just in America, like a lot of people, there was the Great Resignation shortly followed, and a lot of mothers reevaluating whether they want to be in flexible jobs for 40 hours a week. And it's crazy to think that you were in that reaction mode of just doing that because that's what you've been doing without
Yeah.
ever stepping back and thinking, does this make sense? And so,
Oh my
yeah, I think
goodness.
it'll be
Yeah.
very
Some of the stuff
interesting.
we used to do. Yeah. Some of the stuff we used to do, it's just like we can't even do it anymore. I live on the southeast side of DC, and my daughter used to go to Duke Ellington High School. It's a performing arts high school here in Northwest DC. And the other day, I had to like drive to Georgetown for something, and I was like, oh my goodness, it is so far. And I remember thinking, how did I make this trip every single day? You know what I mean? For like, and it's just our bodies slow down. Our bodies slow down in a really beautiful way. And I think we've all been struggling in our own way to sort of re-enter society with this, like it's like once you stop that kind of rigor, it's almost impossible to pick it back up. It doesn't matter if mentally that's what we want to do. At least what I've found is that like physically, socially, spiritually, there is no amount of convincing that I can do to make myself to be at that level of performing and going and doing in the same way that I was before. And I've heard that from a lot of people. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just an interesting time. And I didn't even think about the rejection stories from during that time. Maybe you should do like I don't know, like a pandemic series on just like my rejection story, pandemic time, right? Because
Edition.
it's so, yeah, like I think I just can't imagine um, some of the things that naturally had to happen, right? Like certain things just didn't lend themselves to being online. And the disappointment that may have come with like, man, I thought I was going to be doing X, Y, and Z. And then right when that was supposed to happen, the pandemic happened, right? Like it's almost like it's pandemic sort of forced rejection,
Yeah.
under certain
Yeah. Yeah.
circumstances. Anyway, I don't know. I'm like deep into it, but I love how make rejection stories empowering. And I think that, yeah, I just think that'd be pretty cool. I'd come on.
I think it's a brilliant, yeah, I think it's a brilliant idea. I've had guests talk about their pandemic rejection stories unrelated, just as part of, the episode. But I think that there's so many. I know I had some like of my biggest articles killed in the pandemic just because that they were prioritizing pandemic content, understandably.
Oh,
And for some of the guests I've had on the show, they had book launches that, books like their
oh, so
first
awful.
book, the big book
So
deal, and
awful.
there's no
Oh my
launch because
goodness.
it's a pandemic. No one could leave their homes. So,
Oh,
yeah.
I felt so bad for authors that it was their first book during the pandemic, right? And I think what's also so fascinating is I'm still discovering books that came out during the pandemic because we were so distracted, right? Sarah Blondin is
Yeah.
one of my like favorite meditation teachers, and I was listening to one of her guided meditations on Insight Timer, and she said something like, "Oh, and this is in my book, Heart Minded," and I was like, "Wait a minute, she has a book, right?" And so I go to Google, and sure enough, came out in 2021, so I missed it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it'd be
Please
interesting.
to
I
go
would
back.
definitely tune in. I think want to hear I want to hear how those pandemic rejection stories talk about lowest low, right? And now like here we are 5 years later. What are some of the highest highs that came from that? And what are some of the lessons that we've learned, right? And I think I don't know, I'm just in a in a place of excuse me. I feel like I'm just in a deep place of self-discovery and storytelling
Yeah.
and hearing other stories and being empowered by others' stories and hoping that sharing my story, encourages someone. I just think now more than ever, we need community in sort of any way that we can get it. And the idea that we're not alone in what we're going through, to hear like, man, I had a lowest low just like that, and she survived. I can survive, right? I just think there's a lot of power in that, and I think we need that now more than ever.
I completely agree. And I mean, you just touched on, I think, the most important, what I always say is the most important cornerstone or pillar to rejection resilience, which is community. It's needed, it's been needed at all times of history, but I think we're more isolated than ever before and
Sure.
disconnected through social media. And just one of the things, talking on the pandemic, something one of my clients often talks about is social atrophying. We've lost the ability to just awkwardly connect with humans. People avoid getting in elevators with other humans
Yeah,
because what's going to happen being around a stranger? And I mean, we're wired for connection, so
yeah,
we have to work to build those social muscles again. But Christine, I
absolutely.
know we're coming near to the end, so I have two more questions for you if there's
Sure.
time. So the second to last question, I ask an iteration of this to almost all the guests, and
Mhm.
it's really just if you have any advice on growing this show. I often ask in combination to your expertise. So I know your expertise is very wide. We could talk about taking rest. And by the way, on that, and now I'll just say, your whole thing about selfish, I never even got to comment on that, but I just think that a lesson it took me a long time to learn is that being able to lean into that is really how we help, I think, more people, because it's the whole mask
Mhm.
on. Once our masks on, we can help
Mhm.
other people get their masks on. So I don't think it's
Absolutely.
something we should feel ashamed of. Um, but yeah, I guess if based on your very wide range of expertise, if you were in my shoes and you were growing a podcast, what would be something you would focus on?
I mean, definitely the pandemic stories. I think
Yes,
that would
actually, you've already
be
answered that question.
I think that would be amazing. And I mean, I love everything that you're doing with the show. But I do think that there are so many people who want to tell their pandemic stories and also need to hear these pandemic stories because we were in isolation, for whatever that looks like and means for each of us. And I think we missed that element of
Yeah.
community. And so I think that would be empowering. And then, I don't know, maybe you want to take it offline and have like a My Rejection Story meetup. I
Yeah,
think that
love
could be
to.
cool. Those are my two suggestions.
I love that. Yeah, I'm percolating ways to do meetups, trying where in the world. So
Yeah.
thank you. That's fantastic. And my final question is for people who want to connect with you and your work. Give us, I guess, a little bit of an overview of the best place to start. And yeah, I know obviously they can read your books. Is there any other sort of way they can connect with you? Oh, follow you on
Yeah.
Instagram.
On my Instagram, at I am Christine Platt. And then also on my website, same name, I am christineplatt.com. I have a lot of, when I was doing the most, Alice, I did a lot of podcasts. I did a lot of book talks and conversations that are linked on there, a lot of uh, interviews and sessions with really great people. So love for folks to kind of, check those out, check out my TED Talk,
Yes.
but yeah, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of people, where social media and Instagram used to really be a hub and community, I see that sort of shifting and changing. So I'm still very active. Um, in the sense that like I'm on there every day, but not nearly as active as I was during the pandemic. But I still try to like post every day, check in. I do my own social media. I read my comments. I reply, and so that's definitely one way to engage with me. And I've been, I don't know, trying to think about other ways to really, bring community together. And so hopefully I'll be able to do that with the book. I'd love to have more in-person conversations around less is liberation and really get people to talk about their overwhelm and, talk about how it's really tied to our overall well-being. And so if you stay tuned on my website and social media, I'll be sharing more information on that when the book comes out.
That is so exciting. So definitely grab all the books, but also stay tuned for the in-person meetings because that's where I
Yeah,
believe we'll see more and more of this because this is where we get our oxytocin. So I love that you are
yeah.
going to be taking things offline in the foreseeable future.
Thank
Well,
you.
Christine, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for
Thank
joining me on
you.
my rejection story.
Thank you for having me, Alice. This is wonderful.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.